Hello students, today we're going to be talking about soil and soil properties. That's to prepare us for our soil analysis lab tomorrow. So please take thorough Cornell notes on these slides so you can prepare to know what we're talking about in our lab tomorrow. First up is soil texture. Texture is the way something feels, so we're talking about how soil feels. And that's going to depend on the size of different particles in the soil. So it may not look like it, but soil is actually made up of a mixture of different kinds of particles. And sand, silt, and clay are the three that we talk about here when we're talking about texture. So sand, you need to know, is the largest particle in soil, and it feels gritty. So this is just like sand on the beach. There's sand in our soil. Next up is silt. Silt is the medium-sized particle, and it's going to feel soft or silky or like flour. So silt is about the consistency of, if you think of the cooking flour that you use. And the smallest particle is clay. So though you might not think of it, clay is actually made up of lots of tiny particles, and they're very hard to see, and it feels sticky, just like modeling clay would feel the same. So most soil is made up of a mixture of those three different types of particles. The best soil is about an even mixture of all three of those, and we call that loam. So you need to know that. That's what we want Farmer Berry to have, is a loamy soil. So here's just a little visual for you to see. Clay is the very small particles over here. Silt is the medium-sized particles, and sand is a bigger size particle. So obviously this picture is blown up. Sand is, like I said, about the size of sand you'd find on a beach. And then above that would be gravel or rocks, which we wouldn't consider part of the soil necessarily. This triangle you can use to figure out what type of soil you have. So if you know the percent of each type of particle in your soil, which is what we're going to find out in our lab tomorrow, then you can use this graph to see exactly where your soil lays, and you can see in the middle here is loam, and that's what we want our soil to be, is just a mixture of all three things in this loam category. So why we care so much about soil texture is because if the soil doesn't have the right type of texture, if it has too much of just one thing, then your crops aren't going to be as fertile, they're not going to grow as well. So a sandy soil is not going to retain water as much. Think about how water flows through sand. It's going to do that same thing if there's too much sand in your soil. As you get more silt and clay in your soil, that's a good thing. You're going to have more organic matter, which means the soil can hold on to the good stuff that plants need to survive. It's a better buffer, which means the pH is regulated. And overall, just the soil is able to hold on to more water and nutrients if you have a mixture of sand and silt and clay. If you have too much of clay, then your soil gets really sticky, and if it's sticky, then it's too hard for the water to get through the soil. And so if water can't get through the soil, it can't get down to the plant's roots. So then your soil is not good for growing plants because the water can't get to its roots. Once again, the best soil is a mixture of all three, so the water can flow through, but doesn't flow through so much that it gets lost. So two other words you need to know about soil texture. Porosity means the amount of pores in your soil, pores meaning spaces. And so this would help you because it would allow water to be held in those spaces. Then permeability is the ability of water to flow through your soil. So something like clay would have a high permeability because it is such big particles that it can hold a lot of water and the water can flow through quickly. And as you increase porosity, you also increase permeability. So those two things are related. So the words sound similar, and I would like you to know the definition of both, but if you get confused, they're very similar, and so that's okay too. So as water moves through the soil, it's going to carry materials with it. At some extent, that's a good thing because we want things like nutrients to get to our plant's roots. But if it happens too much, then it's a bad thing, and that's known as leaching, which we learned about when we talked about landfills. So leaching is when water flows through something and carries minerals or nutrients with it. And so for soil, this can be a bad thing because it's going to remove the dissolved nutrients that the plant needs, and it could remove them from the soil because it's just flowing through. So this is not something we want on our farm. Our next soil property is pH. You probably heard about pH in chemistry. It's the same. pH is a measure of how acidic or basic something is, and you can see that scale at the top of your slide, where the acid is over here on the left and the basic things are over here on the right, and then in the middle are neutral substances like water. So soil pH is usually in the range of 4 to 8. Plants are happiest, at least the plants that we're growing, at around 6 to 7 pH. So they like it to be neutral. That's something we're going to look at in the soil, of whether or not our soil is actually neutral or whether it's maybe a little acidic or basic. pH is important to plants because certain things are going to stick to soil better. So soil actually has chemical properties too, and it can bond with chemicals and nutrients in the soil and in the water. And so we want to make sure the pH is right so that those nutrients stay where they are. And if the pH is not right, the nutrients could be leached away by the water. And then another example, number 3, about pesticides. If a soil is too acidic, then pesticides, as well as herbicides and fungicides, wouldn't be absorbed. So they would just run off and you'd have to apply more and more, and they wouldn't be useful. So soil nutrients are going to be really important for farmer bearing. Nutrients are they're the chemicals that plants need to grow healthily. And so she has said some things that make us think that maybe her plants aren't growing super healthy, like they had, I think, wilted leaves and yellowed leaves. Things like that are nutrient deficiencies in her plants. So plants get their nutrients from their roots. So after water comes into the soil, if that water has nutrients in it, it is picked up by the roots of the plant. And each of these nutrients is important for growing the plant. So here are the main nutrients we are going to look at. I do want you to know the chemical symbol for these. Hopefully you've learned these in chemistry, but if not, just remind yourself. So phosphorus is chemical symbol P, nitrogen is N, and the only confusing one is potassium is a chemical symbol of K. So that's the one you have to keep in mind, as it's a little bit different, and then calcium is Ca and magnesium is Mg. So here's what nitrogen does for plants. It's used to make chlorophyll, so the thing that helps plants get their food, and it makes plants green. And this is responsible for the growth and the health of your plant leaves. So if you don't have enough nitrogen, your plant leaves can turn yellow. And so as you see in the picture, there's a healthy plant leaf, and then there's a nitrogen deficient leaf, which is pretty common on farms. And so a lot of fertilizers can be used to add more nitrogen to the soil. If you have too much nitrogen, then you could get long, weak stems and no flowering of your plants. So not enough nutrients, too much nutrients is not usually a problem, because every year when plants grow, they use more and more nutrients. So often the soil has not enough nutrients, but if you, say, added too much fertilizer, these are some of the things you might see. Next is phosphorus. What phosphorus does for plants is it develops their roots. If you don't have enough phosphorus, which is a really common problem, then you could get these purplish colored leaves. So here's an example of some purple tinge on a leaf. And phosphorus is really hard to get into your soil. So we're going to talk about the phosphorus cycle soon. But the reason is that most phosphorus is found in rocks, and it's really hard for rocks to break apart and flow through rivers and get to the water that we need to put into our soil, right? So it takes a long time to do that, which means most of our soil is nitrogen deficient, which can also lead to the plants having a poor root system, underdeveloped, so then they can't pick up as much water. And having too much phosphorus is actually not ever a problem, because like I said, it's a very slow process to get phosphorus, so we're almost always just don't have enough of it. And what does exist gets stuck in the soil or leaches away quickly. So it's something that's pretty hard and pretty tricky to keep around your plants. but we need it. So again, a lot of fertilizers will focus on bringing phosphorus to your soil. And finally is potassium, which a lot of farmers, instead of saying potassium, they'll say potash as an abbreviation. So be able to recognize that. What potassium does is responsible for the growth of your plant. All of these are involved in plant growth. Also regulates opening and closing of stomata. Those are the little holes under the leaves that let in and out water. So if you don't have something to regulate the opening and closing of those holes, you could let out more water than you wanted or keep in too much water. So that can be a big problem for plants. So the signs of not having enough potassium is that you might get brown scorching and curling of the leaves. So if you can see in the bottom, it looks like maybe they were just out in the sun too long, but actually it's because they don't have enough potassium and their leaves are just becoming this color, probably because those stomata aren't open, or they're opening too much and letting out too much water, which makes it look like the leaves don't have enough water. Could also see purple spots under the leaves. And if you have too much potassium, then the plant might lose its ability to absorb other nutrients because potassium can bind to things in the soil and kick out other nutrients that are bound there. So those are the main properties that I wanted you to know about. And please be prepared to use these tomorrow in our lab as we talk about Farmer's Berry's soil and how to make her soil even better based on the nutrient deficiencies that we find. Thanks.